there, it's Marla at Narrate. In this week's message, Adam continues the Cruciform conversation by asking what if the cross is less about what we get, but more about how we live? What if all we need to know about God's character can be seen on the cross? Enjoy the message.
So I realized this week growing up, my dad's prized possession was his 1965 GT Fastback Mustang. He got it when I was probably 7 or 8 years old, and it was the type of car that was mostly restored but not cherry. In hindsight, it was probably something that someone 5 or 10 years before he bought it had restored. And so I was a little tired now, but it was mostly really great. But my dad's not the type that needs to show a car. He's not the type that wants to do that. He drove the thing to the railroad, and my sister, who's a few years older than me, she learned to drive on that car. I actually learned to drive by learning to drive that car. And it was also a 4-speed manual transmission with a Huska 4-speed because first gear was shot and had been for a long time. You had to work really hard to get it in, and then when you were driving down the street, if you weren't paying attention, it would just pop out of first gear, and then you had to get it back into gear. And there was one stoplight in Laurel. It was at the other side of a really aggressive underpass, and so that's how I learned to drive a 4-speed manual transmission. But one day, after I got my license, after my parents got divorced, my dad lived in this downtown house that had this long driveway next to the house where you had to be really careful not to take out the side of the house as you were backing out of the driveway. But Laurel's a small enough town that when you back out, you just kind of back out into the middle of the street, and then eventually you find first gear and you go off on your way. And so I'd done all those things, was trying to find first gear, couldn't find first gear, grinding and just couldn't make it happen. And then I look up and there was a car coming towards me, and before I know it, there's a car coming from behind, and I'm, that sweat thing that happens where suddenly the whole world is shrinking. And so in a moment of juvenile stupidity, I just reached back as far as I could and I just kicked the gear shift, thinking, I'll get this thing into first gear. So I had my foot on the clutch and I just kicked the thing. And for a second, it looked like it was a good idea because it went forward. And then I started to let the clutch out and it just started going backwards. And it quickly became clear that unless I was about to drive myself to baseball practice in reverse, the car wasn't going anywhere. And so I kind of limped the thing to the side of the road. And I don't remember how that phone call went. To my dad's credit, I don't recall being yelled at or anything like that. I just remember something to the effect of, that transmission's been tired for a while anyway, and before long, he took it in and had the transmission rebuilt. But all that to say, adaptability and dealing with change on the fly is one of my strengths in life. I've always been cool under pressure. So this morning, there's a couple different kind of weird shifts happening. It wasn't my intention to actually be speaking, but I'm actually glad that I am because I thought I got 1 week to talk about cruciformity, and we actually get 2. And the bigger shift that I want to make this morning is from this conversation that we've been having about atonement theory and penal substitution and is God or is not God have a vindictive bone in his body. That conversation, which for some of you have been helpful and some of you has been a snooze fest, we are really shifting from that into another one that I think is actually has the potential to be a lot more helpful. For me, it actually takes the conversation about the cross from a theological level, which has importance, and I hope we've kind of bumped into that, but actually brings it right back clearly to the ground, and it starts with this question. Was it important that Jesus died by being crucified? Is that an important tenet of the Scriptures? Not that he was killed, but I mean specifically that he was crucified. Is that important to what Jesus is trying to tell us about who God is and what he's like? Now, that's not actually even my question. My friend Rob, who we've been working through some of this stuff together with, he actually asked it. The more I thought about it, I think it's one of the most brilliant questions you could ask of the New Testament in general. Of what importance is crucifixion specifically? Namely, what if Jesus had been stoned to death? Because that was a common way to kill heretics in the first century Jewish world of Jesus. The idea was that if you were an adult male who heard something from a teacher and were convinced that it was heresy, you had permission to pick up a single rock and throw it at the heretic, and if enough people agreed with you, thus resulting in enough rocks hitting him, and if you all had successful youth baseball careers, that person would die. What if Jesus had been killed the conventional way that heretics were killed? Would it change what the New Testament tells us about God? Or what if he'd have been flogged to death or caned to death? We're told later in Acts that Paul was one time, it was ordered by some magistrates to be beaten within an inch of his life with what really amounted to sticks. Would that have changed? What if he'd been stabbed Like not randomly, but like by a terrorist, so to speak. We know that zealots, ironically, Jesus invited one to follow him, but part of what made zealots in the first century world of Jesus was they so hated the Romans that one of their games was they would brandish little daggers of sorts, and in public marketplaces, in really busy, tightly confined, packed places, the types of places that people like me loathe, they would just sidle up next to a Roman soldier, and they already knew where the weak spots were in their armor, and they would slide the blade right through the vest, and they would slip away undetected. What if Jesus had been killed something like that? Not that he would have been wearing armor, but he could have easily just been anonymously stabbed. What if he'd have died that way? We know that the road from Jerusalem to Jericho is a very winding, treacherous road that covers a lot of elevation, loss in the case of going from Jerusalem to Jericho. What if Jesus would have been purposely pushed off a cliff, like sabotage style? And the result would have been some kind of brain contusion that would have ultimately cost him his life. Would it matter to guys like Paul? Would it matter to the New Testament authors if Jesus had died not by crucifixion, but in those other ways? Well, cruciformity, which I'm guessing is a bit of a new word for you, it was for me as well. Cruciformity says absolutely it matters. That at the center of the story is the base, humiliating, reserved for the worst, Roman citizens couldn't experience it, form of execution called crucifixion. We've talked a little bit about polite Roman people wouldn't even say the word. It was like Voldemort. They just wouldn't even say cruciform. They didn't want to associate themselves with it because it was a way of distinguishing class. It was for the very, very worst. Cruciformity says that Jesus was crucified matters. Last October, I was in Portland taking a class as an alum. I can kind of it's like the ideal college experience because you don't have to take any classes towards a degree. You can just take whichever ones you want. And so that's what I've been doing for a while. And one of the guys that I graduated with is on staff there now, and he's been telling me about this professor, Nijay Gupta, and I didn't have a class from him. He wasn't there when I graduated, but my friend John keeps telling me, Nijay, he's the man. And so actually Nijay's going to be here in November. That'll be fun. He's going to talk about cruciformity from the book of Romans. I saved all that for him. And he agreed. So I had coffee with Nijay, and really what I did is I sat down. I was in maybe the culminating stages of really wanting to dive into these questions we've been asking, and I just, for the first 10 or so minutes, just kind of all the tension, all the apprehension, all the questions, everything that's kind of been driving on the front end of this series, I just kind of laid that all out there. And after listening to me, and after I finally was quiet, which is sometimes hard to remember, like when in a room with somebody who's 10 times 10 smarter than you, just listen, stop talking. But he finally asked me a question, and he said, Adam, have you ever heard of cruciformity? And I said, no. And he did this like, oh, I'm so bummed that you graduated from this institution. Have you never even heard the phrase? And for the next 30 or so minutes, he started unpacking for me a way of understanding the cross that I think has the potential to really shift the way we think about this. And for me, it's been a pretty comprehensive, pretty helpful thing. But cruciformity at its core says this, or maybe asks this. What if the cross is less about what we get because of it, but more about a way to live? Like, what if the cross is less about this commodity that we ingest or this card that we carry? What if it's literally the ideal form to live, an ideal way to live for those who haven't found a way that actually works yet? In fact, what if as we try to make sense of some of the New Testament figures like Paul, what we understand is that the notion that God was crucified completely blew their minds and shifted everything that they thought they understood about God. Think of a blacksmith. For some reason, this image has helped me think about cruciformity because it's two words. It's cruciform. It's cross-formed. And what cruciformity asks is, what if what it means to be a Christian is to retell the story of the cross with your life and mine and ours collectively? Think of what a blacksmith does, right? Like big beard, hairy arms, big forearms. Maybe you've been to that museum in Bozeman and watched those guys stick this raw piece of iron in some coals, and then they take it out, and on an anvil, they're pounding that thing, shaping that thing into some practical form, a garden implement, or in the Middle Ages, a sword. What if the cross is a way of modeling for us God's win for us That the actual thing is not what we get and it's not a commodity that we consume, but a cross-shaped form that our lives take. And what if that explains what happened to the Apostle Paul? Now, first century Jews, what we know is that for faithful Jews, their assignment was clear. To get to know God personally and yet with deep reverence, to get to know their Redeemer, the Creator, the Sovereign, and they gave their lives to this in ways maybe many of you are today. And the Apostle Paul was their best. I mean, he was the cream of the crop. He was the PhD. He was the all-star. He was the MVP. He was the valedictorian. Nobody embodied the goals of Judaism better than the Apostle Paul. In fact, the Apostle Paul says it this way in Philippians, and what he's doing here is stepping into also Roman culture, where in Roman culture, you would boast about your credentials, especially your genetic credentials or your family of origin credentials. And Paul says this in Philippians 3, if someone else thinks they have reasons to put confidence in the flesh, I have more. Now, flesh here isn't the way we often think about it in evangelicalism, like sin. It's just, again, it's their genetics. It's their family line. If someone thinks they have reasons to brag, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day, the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, in regard to the law, a Pharisee. And this day, if you could trace your lineage all the way back to the one of the 12 tribes as a Jewish person, that was a big deal. If then you hit the jackpot and you were from the tribe of Benjamin, that's a big deal. Plus, he's a Pharisee. They took the law most seriously. As for zeal, persecuting the church. As for righteousness based on the law, faultless. Paul was the guy. Wow, that was my phone. That's my wife. Does she not know what we're doing today? Just going to turn that off. It's funny. Paul was the quintessential first century Jewish person. And yet to know Paul's story is to know that there was something that changed. He had this initial encounter with the crucified Jesus, and that word seems to be important there. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? He heard this voice on this road to an obscure town, or a town to kill more Christians, obscure to us. And he had an ongoing encounter to the extent that years later, here's the way he would summarize his life, 1 Corinthians 2. For I have resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. Now, I'm not a word scholar, but I'm good at plagiarism, and what word scholars tell me is that word and there, and him crucified, is probably more effectively translated, that is Jesus crucified. So it's not like I know two things, Jesus and Jesus crucified. Paul's going, there's really only one thing that matters. Jesus crucified. What gets Paul to this place where really what he's doing is offering a very narrow understanding of God? Like Paul is, and if you're familiar, and part of the argument of cruciformity, you guys, is that everything Paul says when read through this window makes more sense. It's a very narrow window to say, I spent my whole life studying about God, I was the quintessential Jewish person, and yet in the end, I decided it was all a waste of time except for this one thing that I needed to know. And I learned that when I learned about a Jesus who went to the cross. Ever started over? Ever felt the need to? Richard Rohr, this great popular Catholic thinker, he argues that all of our lives have two halves. And the second half starts, he says that the midlife crisis doesn't follow a predictable chronology, or at least, in terms of when you turn 40 or when you turn 50 or when you turn 30. He says the second half of life, or the midlife crisis, occurs when you come to the realization that everything that worked in the first half no longer works. He says there's this shift that happens in the human experience, and what happens is we spend the first half of life, whether that's 30, 40, 50, 60 years, learning to control our lives. He says the midlife crisis occurs when we realize that everything we thought we could do to control our life doesn't work anymore. And the crisis is we're left in this state of vulnerability because the answers and the tools that we've spent our lifetime developing, time after time, they're not working anymore. Divorce, illness, death, loss of a job. See, it seems that Paul had that type of experience. He lived the first half as this quintessential Jew, mastering God, explaining him better than anybody could. And then the second half of his life, when you look back at his writing, what you see is he just kept going like, there's really only one thing you need to know. And that's the Jesus who went to the cross. What if he's not just being cute? What if his message really was everything you ever needed to know about God is found at Calvary? Everything you need to know about God's character is discovered when you discover that God willingly went to the cross. Now, Philippians 2 would be a place where he unpacks this theology. In fact, there's a guy named Michael Gorman who's this great thinker who is kind of at the head of this whole cruciformity conversation. He's a friend with N.T. Wright. They do some teaching together. But Michael Gorman, I've tried to read his books. I understand like 10% of them. He writes way above my head. But in one of his books called Cruciformity, what he does is he argues that there is a formula and a pattern that you can read into every one of Paul's purported letters. And it follows this pattern, Philippians 2. Now, what we're quoting here is a hymn that Paul quotes. He didn't write it. It's a lot like that creed that we've talked about throughout this series. It's a hymn that he's leaning into. And listen to this. Who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God as something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death. And here it is, even death on a cross. Therefore, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Now, notice first of all that what Paul is saying here is we get as much information about Jesus and God from his humiliation as we do his exaltation. That there's as much to glean from the cross as there is the resurrection. But scholars, and again, I'm not one, but I can plagiarize them, what they observe here is this although because component. That what they say is because it starts like this. Although he was God, he stooped, he served. So although he was God, he didn't act like God. And part of what we discover in cruciformity is, he didn't act like the God that we think he is. He's not the empire God. He doesn't use power the way we do. Although he was God, he stooped, and only later was he exalted. I was having lunch this week with a friend who's, I think, teaching this weekend at a kind of a Christian conference, and it was kind of funny. Maybe I'm a snob, but because he was asked to speak on what it means to be a layperson in the church. I was like, whoa, I haven't heard that word in a long time. But layperson, of course, just means like not staff, and I didn't want to get into the fundamental disconnects I have with even some of those words. But he was very graciously asking, and actually one of the things he wanted to ask me is like, Adam, so how do people like me be helpful to people like you? Now, this is a person who's been around here since the Cinemark, since like the very first days of Narrate. And as I was listening to him, I was like, wait a minute. I said, I think you're misunderstanding, and from my perspective, how this thing works. I said, what's made you so incredibly helpful over the years is you just showed up and you just got to work. You heard an announcement about needing ushers or needing kids ministry or splitting firewood, and you just showed up like you just worked. And I started to explain to him like what's so humbling to the staff and I is the realization that on Sunday, you're here at 6 o'clock running the soundboard. On Sunday, you're up here playing in the band. On Sunday, you're making coffee or you're attending 2 services because you're gonna attend one and teach at another. On Sunday, you're staying late because you're tearing down. What's humbling to us is like this sense of people who show up and work, but then on Monday, like you're the boss. On Monday, you've got lots of initials after your name. On Monday, you've got a lot of diapers to change, and yet you still change some of the ones here on Sunday. On Monday, you're kind of a big deal. You're the president of a bank. You're a big old salesperson. And what I explained to him is, from my perspective, what's helpful is you didn't show up with any kind of pedigree and go like, well, here's all my list of credentials. You just served. That, although he was God, although you're the president, although you're this dignified person, although you're a busy parent, you serve. I was standing in line in a restaurant recently, and I want to be careful because I understand how difficult it would be to run a restaurant. But it was the type of restaurant that I go to often enough that I know when it's busy and when it's not, and when it's understaffed and when it's not. And this is one of those days where I was actually in laid-back Adam mode, so it wasn't even a big deal. Honestly, I wasn't angry, but I was about halfway through the line, it became apparent, like, oh boy. And we all know this, right? That the coffee shop, you know when you're like, oh geez, is it too late to pull the plug? You could tell, like, it was busier than they normally are. You could tell there were fewer staff than there would normally be. And about halfway through the line, I was like, I've been here longer. And then I looked over my shoulder, and it was like, you just kind of want to put a sign up, like, go home. Don't, like, leave the back of the line. And then as I was standing there, this person walked out of what was obviously like some kind of office somewhere, and they came back behind the till. And I know them to be the owner because they've identified me as the owner at one point, or they identified themselves as the owner and thanked me for being there as often as I am. And so they came back behind, and they were kind of rifling through the till or something in that area, obviously doing some kind of business, looking for some kind of business paperwork stuff. And again, it's like 11:55 on a Friday. So I mean, it's not a mystery that these are the busy hours. And he's looking through his stuff, and I watched them turn and kind of do this, and like they saw us, saw the employees, saw the people, saw us, and went back. And then a second time, and I watched it, and he saw us. And then I watched him find what he was after, and he just left. And I remember thinking, dude, you just missed the chance to tell a completely different story to your staff. Now, I'm not claiming to be the perfect one of that. Actually, the person I started thinking about was my friend Greg Cherrick. Now, Greg helped me. Greg helped us start the student ministry at Harvest. He was about 10 years older than me. He was this awesome, genius business person like many of yourselves. He had this pretty recent encounter with Jesus about the time we started Harvest, and he's just like, how can I help? And he was that guy for the first several years of our student ministry and Billings existence. But one thing I knew about Greg, who tragically passed actually just a few years ago, but one thing I knew about Greg was that if you wanted to catch him between about 11 and 1, it wasn't going to happen. Because Greg's family business, and he was the operator, he owned all the Taco Johns in Billings and Laurel. And he had told me before that over those, I think it was 5 restaurants, the answer to the question, are you hiring, was yes. 365, 7 days a week, the answer was yes. And he told me, that being the case, I can hire about 1 competent employee a week. And so what I knew about Greg was he was perpetually understaffed. And so the reason you didn't try to get Greg, though he was one of the most helpful people I've ever known between 11 and 1, was because between 11 and 1, you know where you found Greg? At whatever Taco John's was the most poorly staffed that day. Like not standing in the parking lot glad-handing, not off to the side in the restaurant with his clipboard evaluating managers. No, Greg had the gloves on and the hairnet on, and he was putting potato olays in the fryer, and he was, filling up Cokes, and he was doing any number of things that any other employee might do. Greg was a servant, and that's why as soon as I had that experience at that restaurant, I thought of Greg, and I thought, why? Although he's God, he's not behaving like the boss. Although he's the king, he's serving. Jesus warned us about this. In fact, at one point, there's this interaction that goes on where it's funny to me that there were 12 disciples because there's 12 kids on a travel baseball team. And so at one point, a mom came up to Jesus and was like, hey, our kids should really be batting first and second and playing shortstop and second base. And Jesus was like, yeah, but they can't hit. And they're like, yeah, but they had one last week. And they're like, no, let me. And then all the other parents, all the other travel parents whose kids are also going to the MLB, they found out that there had been this thing that had happened. And so everybody's all kind of hot and bothered. And Jesus pulls them aside. And in what's potentially an all too familiar story, Jesus gets right at cruciformity. Says, that the rulers of the Gentile lord it over them, and all their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So that's the although. But here's the part that'll mess me up. Go back to that although because just for a second, will you? Scholars, and again, I'm not one, not that, the although because thing. sorry, it probably doesn't matter. We can just stay blank. The other piece of this is guys like Mark Gorman, they'll look at the original language and they'll go, there's kind of an although thing going on there. Although he's God. But maybe Paul's shift was there's also a because thing happening there. Like another way to break down this hymn is because he was God, he served. Which again, that grates in our preconceived assumptions about power, about what it means to be God, about what it means to be the boss. But what if part of what happened to Paul here was he went, wait a minute, we thought God was like Zeus. We were expecting that kind of like warlord God. But because he's God, he serves. That's the epitome of cruciformity. Is that you go like, why the cross? And cruciformity says, there might not be anything God could have done that would have more thoroughly explained the character of God. He didn't just die, he was murdered. He wasn't just murdered, he took on the most humiliating, the most shaming, the most painful. The word excruciating was invented to describe the pain involved with crucifixion. Why? Well, because that's what God does. It's like, Greg, why are you flipping potato lays? He's like, well, because that's what it means to be the boss. What do you mean, why am I flipping potato lays? The question would be, why wouldn't I be flipping potato lays? There's a formula for some of you math nerds that comes out of this. Go ahead to that next slide. And what Michael Gorman suggests is that you can place this formula over everything else Paul does in the New Testament. He argues that it's kind of the framework of all of Paul's theological work, and it's this: although X, not Y, but Z. Although, because he's God, he doesn't claim that power. He serves. Now, the danger here is that we become moved by that, but we miss the punchline, which is what? I mean, listen to what Paul says. And we're going to explore this a little bit more next week, but in Galatians, Paul doesn't just go like, this is so awesome, look what Jesus did for us. Paul shifts his thinking and going, okay, this changes everything about what I thought it meant to be human. I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. What's he saying? When I get out of bed, what shapes and forms the way I make decisions is Christ was crucified. Like, he's not just describing how we get to heaven, is what cruciformity is arguing. Paul has discovered the secret to the answer of life, the formula. And it's this, that when you find yourself in a position of power, you use it to serve, not to be served. That suffering, easier said than done, is this opportunity to retell the story of Jesus to a world that's formulas don't work. Towards the end of my time with Nijay, he was explaining to me that he spends most of his life as a professional Christian. We can go to that next slide. And he said, Adam, when I find myself in a context where I'm not a professional Christian and I'm just another person and someone's going like, you're a Christian, why are you a Christian? Kind of back home, he was talking about growing up in Ohio. He said, anymore, I just ask one question. I just say, are you satisfied with your life? And he said, what I find is if someone says yes, then I'm not gonna bully him anymore. There's nothing I can do that, if the gospel is cruciformity, there's nothing I can do to help them at that point. But if they say no, he says, then I say, well, have you considered the cruciform life? The counterintuitive, countercultural, opposite in many ways of the American mindset way of life that says the most wildly fulfilling version of life is the one where you die daily. Which I guess leaves us with this question. Are you satisfied with your life? And even, are you satisfied with your experience of faith? And if not, maybe this cruciformity conversation invites you into this upside-down way of living that's actually wildly fulfilling. And for that, I'd love to talk more next week. Let me pray. God, thanks for this constant reminder in the text that what it means to follow you is to serve others. And God, we know we got to have boundaries and there's things that we have to put in place there, but we also know, Lord, that that we don't drift towards service, we don't drift towards self-sacrifice, we don't drift towards our lives being about others, not ourselves. We only get there if we grab the steering wheel and make a concerted effort every day to steer things in that direction. Jesus, thanks that you epitomized your self-giving love by going to the cross on our behalf. We love you. Amen.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.